Welcome all viewers to our channel. We are glad to see you here where we share amazing stories from people's lives. Each of you is important to us and we will be interested to know what country and city you are from. Please write about it in the comments. Now let's move on to our first story. The summer sunset cast a golden glow over the suburbs, and the air was filled with the sounds of carefree laughter and the rustling of the wind in the trees. The Williams home stood in a cozy neighborhood where families spent time in a friendly atmosphere. For David Williams, this evening was a rare moment of peace. David stood at the grill, spatula in hand, flipping juicy steaks that smelled like smoke. His hands, strong and well-trained from years of service with the FBI, weren't holding guns or filling out reports. Today they were doing something much more enjoyable, cooking dinner for his beloved family. On a nearby lawn, his 6-year-old daughter Sophie squealed as she ran away from her older brother Liam, who was holding a water pistol. "Daddy, tell Liam he's not playing fair," shouted the girl, taking cover behind her mother, who was sitting in a garden chair with a glass of lemonade. "Liam, be a man, don't shoot unarmed people," David joked, smiling. "This is a special operation, Dad. We have no rules here," laughed 12-year-old Liam, rushing back into the attack. Monica, David's wife, was watching them with a smile, enjoying this family idyll. She had just put a salad and a pitcher of iced tea on the table. "Just a little more and dinner will be ready," David announced, removing the finished steaks to a plate. The streetlights were beginning to come on, and neighbors from nearby houses were coming out to their lots, nodding toward the Williamses. Family harmony was felt in every movement, every word. For David, these moments were especially precious. Working for the FBI took up a lot of his time, but today he was here with his wife, his children, his beloved home. And suddenly everything changed. At first it was a hum, barely audible against the silence. Then it grew louder, becoming the ominous roar of several engines. Red and blue lights flashed on the street, and patrol cars appeared from around the corner. Monica frowned, standing up from her chair. "What's going on here?" she asked quietly. The children stopped, frozen in place. David put the trowel aside, his gaze wary. "It'll be okay," he said, more to himself than the others, and took a step toward the gate. 4 cars screeched to a halt right in front of their house, and armed police officers ran out of them. They instantly surrounded the station, pointing their guns at David. "David Williams," came the voice of one of the officers in front of me. "You are under arrest on suspicion of murder, gang affiliation, and drug trafficking." "What the?" David raised his hands, slowly stepping back. "This is some kind of mistake." The officer, a stout middle-aged man with a sullen expression, pointed his weapon at him. "Face down on the ground, now," he shouted. Monica ran up to the children, cradling them against her, her face white as chalk. "What are you doing?" she screamed. "He didn't do anything." "Madam, stay where you are," one of the policemen shouted, pointing his gun in her direction. "Calm down," David said calmly, trying to keep the situation under control. He turned to the senior officer. "I'm an FBI agent. I have an ID in my pocket. You can check it. This is a mistake." But David's words seemed to vanish into thin air. "FBI? Of course," the officer said sarcastically. "So what's next? The Prince of Nigeria? You think you can get us in?" "Dad!" Liam shouted out, but Monica gripped his shoulder tightly, keeping him from moving. The police officers did not allow David to explain himself. 2 officers grabbed him, turned him sharply to the ground, and handcuffed him. "This is some kind of mistake," David said, holding back his anger. "Check my ID. I'm an FBI agent. I'm clean." But his words again went unheeded. "You can't prove anything," the senior officer said, squinting. "We have a warrant." Neighbors, attracted by the noise, came out of their houses. Some people started filming what was happening on their phones. "Look what they're doing," whispered one of the women in a neighboring lot. "This is insane," another one echoed. But the police continued their work, as if not noticing the witnesses. David was put in a patrol car. Monica was ordered to follow the officers with the children. A warm family evening had turned into a nightmare. The kebabs remained on the grill, crackling quietly. Liam's water pistol lay on the lawn, and Monica's glass of lemonade was upside down, leaving a puddle on the ground. The cars with blinkers disappeared around the corner, leaving behind shocked neighbors and a shattered idol. Ahead, David and his family faced a difficult ordeal that would change their lives forever. Patrol cars with their blinkers on broke the silence of the night. The sirens had stopped blaring, but the red-blue glow continued to dance across the walls of the Williams house, illuminating the frightened faces of the children frozen in the doorway. David sat on the ground near his grill, hands cuffed behind his back. His barbecue-stained t-shirt was now sticking to his body from sweat and the ground as he was roughly pinned to the ground. "This is crazy," he breathed out, trying to stay calm. "You're making a big mistake. I'm an FBI agent. My badge." The senior officer, the one in charge of the operation, stopped right in front of David. His face was a mixture of contempt and boredom. "And I'm the King of England," he grinned, squinting his eyes. "You're a black man in a decent neighborhood with money. We know what you do." "This is not a joke," David tried to hold back, but his voice still trailed off. "My badge is in my left pocket. Just look at it." The officer leaned over, pretending to check his pocket, but instead elbowed David sharply in the back, causing him to lean even lower. "Hold your tongue or you might not get up," he whispered, glaring at him. Monica, Liam, and Sophie stood at the door. The children huddled against their mother, unable to understand why their father was being treated like this. "Daddy!" Sophie shouted, sobbing. "Shut up, little girl!" One of the officers shouted, pointing his hand at them, but Monica quickly shielded the children. "Leave us alone!" Her voice shook with fear and anger. "Madam, one more word and you will follow him," the other policeman said dryly, looking into her eyes. Monica clutched the children tighter, trying to hold back the tears. "That's my husband. You don't realize who you're dealing with. This is a mistake." "No, madam, it's you who doesn't realize where you are." The senior officer grinned without turning around. Neighbors began to appear on the street. Some looked out of their windows, while others cautiously stepped out of their houses. A group of young people from a neighboring house were already filming what was happening on their phones, trying to remain unnoticed. "That's David," one of them said quietly. "The one who works for the federal agency. He couldn't have done it." "Look how they humiliate him," whispered a woman in her 40s, standing on the porch of her house. "They don't even listen to him." One of the police officers noticed he was being filmed and stepped to the side. "Hey, put the phone away or I'll confiscate it," he yelled, but the neighbors didn't stop. "They have no right to treat him like that," one of them said. "It's a family. I've seen them have barbecues every Saturday night. And now he's being charged with what? Murder! That's bullshit!" replied the neighbor indignantly. The officers, meanwhile, lifted David up, holding him by the shoulders as if they feared he would escape. His head was down, his face contorted with pain, but he tried not to show weakness. "I have rights," he said quietly but firmly. "You can't—" "License?" the senior officer interrupted him, grinning. "The only right you have is to remain silent." They put him in a patrol car, slamming the door so hard that a neighbor's dog started barking. Monica took a step forward, trying to move closer, but was stopped by the officer's gesture. "Watch the children, madam, and stay in the house. Next step and you'll be sitting for obstruction of justice." She wanted to scream, to argue, to fight, but she knew she would only hurt herself by doing so. As the cars drove away, silence hung over the street, broken only by Sophie's muffled cries. Monica stood still, hugging her children as the neighbors came closer. "It's terrible," Mrs. Hill, who lives across the street, said quietly. "We all know David. He couldn't have done anything like this." "They didn't even leave him a chance to explain," Mr. Carter added. "Did you take this off?" Monica asked, turning to the neighbors. The young man nodded, holding the phone in his hand. "Yeah, everything that happened. We're going to put it on social media. You can't just leave it there." Inside the Williams house, there was dead silence. The grill, forgotten in the backyard, continued to smolder. Uneaten dishes remained on the table. The air was a strange mixture of the smells of meat, lemonade, and the ground where David had been pinned. But that evening will never again be the way it is remembered. The shadow of the police cars and the screams of children blended into this night as firmly as the red and blue reflections on the walls of their house. This was where the nightmare only began. The patrol car in which David was sitting was speeding down the night highway. The sparse lights and dark silhouettes of trees flashed outside the window, but David paid no attention to them. His thoughts were focused on what had happened and on what else might happen. His cuffed hands were slack, and his wrists burned from the tight metal. In the front seats, the police officers, not bothering to maintain decorum, were loudly discussing the suspect. "You know what the funny thing is?" said one of them, the younger one, with a smirk on his face. "This guy really thinks his badge means something." "That's what they all think," said the older man behind the wheel. "But if you look like him, a badge is just a piece of plastic." David was silent. He wanted to shout, to argue, to prove his innocence, but he knew it was useless. Every move he made, every word he spoke, could be used against him. In another car behind the convoy, Monica and the children were traveling. They were seated together, but the atmosphere inside was tense and threatening. Monica held Sophie in her arms, trying to soothe her with quiet whispers, but the girl kept sobbing. Liam sat with his hands clasped in his lap, a stony expression on his face. "Do you realize you're making a mistake?" Monica turned to the policeman in the front seat. "Madam," he replied dryly without turning around, "if you continue, I can put you in a separate cell." Her heart clenched with anger and fear, but she silenced herself. All she could do now was be there for the children. When the car stopped in front of the police station, David was pulled out first. He was pushed so sharply that he almost fell over. "Careful," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Walk," one of the policemen cut him off, taking him by the elbow. Monica and her children watched from another car. As she was let out, the officer pointed his hand roughly at the door. "Follow me," he said without looking at her. "I want to be with my husband," she objected. "This is not a resort, ma'am. The children will go with you to their own room. Your husband will be where he belongs." David was led into a room with gray walls and fluorescent lighting. On the way to the cell, he kept trying to explain the situation. "Check my ID. Call the FBI. You have to, You need to shut up." He was interrupted by the same senior officer in charge of the arrest. "You're not here to give orders." David was pushed into a small cell with a metal bench and scratchy walls. One of the policemen grinned before leaving. "Welcome home, Agent." Meanwhile, Monica and the children were led into the interrogation room. Sophie clung to her mother, not letting go of her hand. Liam stared at the floor, lips pressed together. "You have no right to treat us like this," Monica said to the officer who closed the door behind them. "We are entitled to whatever we see fit, madam," he replied and walked away, leaving them alone. In the cell, David tried to remain calm, but every minute made him more and more tense. The police officers who passed by threw derogatory comments in his direction. "FBI? Of course you are. We're all agents here." "Hey, agent, tell me, where'd you get that awesome fake ID?" David clenched his fists, but forced himself not to react. He knew that any outburst of emotion would only make his situation worse. Monica, left in the room with the kids, was thinking about how to get them out of this situation. She didn't have a phone to call a lawyer, and none of the police officers wanted to talk to her. "Mom," Liam said quietly, finally breaking the silence. "Will they let Dad go?" "Of course they will," Monica replied, though she wasn't sure what she meant. She hugged the children, trying to hide her own fear. Meanwhile, in the quarters of the station, the first signs that the story was getting publicity began to appear. Several calls from journalists and lawyers began to reach the department. But the officers involved in the arrest have so far ignored them. Things were heating up at the station. At this point, David and his family were held hostage to the injustice and indifference of the system. But the first cracks were beginning to appear, and soon that night would be a turning point not only for the Williams family, but also for those who tried to break them. David sat on the cold metal bench in his cell. The fluorescent light was crushing his eyes, and the heavy silence, broken only by the sound of the guard's footsteps, was becoming torture. Questions swirled in my mind. How could this have happened? Why did they believe in my guilt so easily? Who was behind it? But the answers were on the other side of the camera, in the investigations department, where truth was mixed with bias and indifference. A few hours ago, the police department received a call from an unreliable witness. The man's emotional voice reported that he had seen a dangerous criminal in their neighborhood. According to him, the man had recently committed a robbery and a murder. He mentioned that the suspect was a black male, tall, with short hair, and pointed to the house where David lived. The cops, not bothering with detailed checks, quickly created a profile of a suspect who matched David's description. They matched it to a database and found some old records of another man with a similar appearance who was wanted in a neighboring state. "We have confirmation," one of the detectives said when this information was voiced. "Let's go get him." No one even thought to ask for details. No one compared photos or fingerprints. "If he's not guilty of that," said the senior officer, rising from the table, "he's probably guilty of something else." As the police cars drove out to the Williams house, their attitude was far from professional. They had already formed an image of the culprit in their heads, and the fact that the man was black only reinforced their confidence. "So, do we place our bets?" The driver winked at his partner. "Can we find a weapon on him?" "Of course," he replied, grinning. "At men like him don't go around unarmed." They didn't discuss what would happen if they were wrong. The thought never even crossed their minds. While David sat in his cell, his case was being worked on in the office next door. Or rather, what could be called work. "So, what do we have on him?" the detective asked, nodding at the file with the information. "Black male, tall, strong," one of the officers began. "He was spotted in the area of the house. Looks like our suspect." "Like?" the detective asked again, but his tone didn't make him uncomfortable. "Yeah, height and build match." "Fine," the detective said, tossing the file on the desk. "Let him sit. We'll check it out later." At this time, calls started coming into the building. Several lawyers and journalists who had received information from neighbors and witnesses tried to find out what was going on. One of the lawyers demanded a comparison of the data with the real suspect, but his requests were ignored. "Let him wait his turn," the site manager replied coldly. Hours later, a junior member of the department decided to check the database to find a picture of the suspect they supposedly matched David to. When he saw the image, his face turned pale. "It's not him," he muttered. The man in the photo was a man who, although matching in height and build, had long dreadlocks and tattoos on his neck. David had neither dreadlocks nor tattoos. "It's not a coincidence," the employee told the senior officer. "Are you sure?" he said lazily, still holding his coffee cup. "Absolutely, it's a different person." The officer rolled his eyes. "All right," cell phone rings. "Call a couple detectives. Let them find out." But while the information was reaching those who might be able to work something out, time passed and David continued to sit in his cell. David didn't know what had happened. He saw the police officers talking among themselves, bringing in folders and papers, but no one approached him. "Can you at least check my ID?" he asked as one of the officers passed by. "We have everything we need," he replied coldly. Meanwhile, there was an oppressive silence in the room where Monica and the children were. Sophie had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder, and Liam was still staring at the floor. "Why do they do that?" he finally asked. Monica didn't know what to answer. "Because they don't want to know the truth," she said quietly. When the mistake became obvious, the site manager realized that the situation was taking a dangerous turn. Video footage shot by neighbors began circulating on social media, causing a wave of outrage. "We need to do something," one of the junior officers said, looking at the phone screen. "To do?" snorted the older man. "We'll do anything once we figure out how to get out of this." At this point, the case ceased to be a mistake. It became a reflection of a system where bias and indifference outweighed the truth. But this mistake, like an avalanche, has already begun to destroy everything in its path. Time passed slowly. There were no windows in the cell where David was, only the dim light of a fluorescent lamp. The metal bench, cold and uncomfortable, pressed into his body every second, as if punishing him for crimes that didn't exist. He tried to stay calm, focusing on his breathing. But thoughts of Monica and the kids came back again and again. They were supposed to be home, safe, and instead his family was caught up in this nightmare. Meanwhile, in another part of the police station, Monica struggled with growing despair. Her eyes were red with tears, but the fire of determination still burned in them. Monica asked for permission to call several times, but the police officers were indifferent. "Your rights will be read to you later, madam," the officer said, not even bothering to lift his head from his clipboard. She knew she was wasting time and couldn't wait for someone to pay attention to her. Her phone was confiscated, but she saw one of her neighbors videoing the arrest. That video is probably already being circulated somewhere. Taking a deep breath, She tried to speak to the officer again. I have small children, she said. I need access to a phone to get in touch with a lawyer. You are violating our rights. The officer finally looked up, but instead of sympathy, there was only coldness in his eyes. Your husband is a suspect, ma'am. It's best to accept that. Those words made Monica shudder, but she didn't break down. She knew she couldn't lose her temper now. Fortunately, a neighbor named Carl, who filmed the arrest on his phone, wasted no time. He had already uploaded the video to Facebook and Twitter, accompanying it with the words, "This is an injustice. The Williams family deserves better." The video went viral in a matter of hours. People began sharing it, adding their comments about police brutality and bias. In another part of town, Monica's friend Laura spotted the video. She immediately recognized her children and her husband. Laura didn't wait. She called the Williams family's general counsel, John Meyer. They arrested David, she said in a shaky voice. It's a total outrage. You have to help. John, an attorney with extensive experience. In the interrogation room where Monica sat with the children, the atmosphere became increasingly tense. Sophie finally woke up and looked around fearfully. Mom, are we going home? She asked quietly. Yes, sweetheart, Monica answered, pulling her to her. We'll be home soon. But Liam didn't share his mother's optimism. They won't let us go, he said coldly, with bitterness in his voice. Liam, don't say that, Monica chided him. But it's true, they hate us just because of the way we look. It's because of Dad. Those words pierced Monica's heart. She saw the fear and resentment tearing her son from the inside out. Liam, it's not your fault. It's not Daddy's fault, she said firmly. They're wrong, but we'll prove the truth. When the officer finally returned to take Monica's statement, she met his gaze calmly but with determination. I demand a lawyer, she said, looking straight into his eyes. As I was saying, ma'am, don't ma'am me, she interrupted. You're violating our rights. My husband was arrested on false charges, and I will prove it. Her voice was firm, but calm. The officer, clearly annoyed, left the room, leaving them alone again. While this was happening, social media began to buzz with outrage. The comments under Carl's video were multiplying at breakneck speed. This is outrageous. How much longer is this going to go on? Hold on, we're with you. The video was seen by a local journalist who has been investigating cases of police brutality for several years. He published the story on a news website, adding his questions. How is this possible? Why didn't the police conduct a thorough investigation before arresting him? Toward evening, John Meyer, the family's attorney, finally arrived at the station. He went straight to the shift supervisor. I represent David Williams, he stated. My client is being unlawfully detained. We are conducting an investigation, the chief replied with irritation. An investigation? John interjected. Or are you trying to cover up your own mistakes? The warden didn't answer, but his silence spoke louder than any words. Monica, upon hearing of John's arrival, was relieved. She knew that the fight had only just begun, but now they had a chance. Long hours of interrogations, trials, and attempts to prove their innocence lay ahead of them. But one thing was certain. Monica was no longer screaming into the void. Her voice was being heard. It all started with one short video that Carl shot that ill-fated evening. But what started as a personal recording of a neighborhood conflict turned into a powerful media storm that took over the city and captured the attention of the entire country. Carl uploaded his video to Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, accompanying the post. We cannot remain silent. David Williams is a father, a husband, and a man who deserves respect and justice. The police can't just do as they please. We all need to fix this. Carl's video went viral. Within a few hours, it gained millions of views. People from different corners of the city and the country started sharing the footage, adding their stories of encounters with biased law enforcement agencies. Each comment was a separate cry in defense of justice. From social media, the real action began. Groups of activists organized rallies outside the police department. They waved placards. Justice for the Williamses. We need an end to racism in the system. Trust the truth, not preconceived notions. Amber Jones, a well-known activist and leader of the African American rights movement in the city, led the rally. His voice sounded confident into the megaphone. Today, we don't just come for David Williams. We come for everyone who faces injustice, for everyone who feels that the system does not protect but suppresses. The crowd supported him with shouts and applause. People from different races and professions united in the fight for justice. The Voice of the City publication sent reporters to all the locations connected to the Williams family's arrest. Reporter Emily Carson met with neighbors who also witnessed the arrest and obtained their stories and video. She made inquiries to the police department and asked, "Why was there no thorough investigation into the arrest? Why were all assumptions made based only on a description from an unreliable witness?" Emily gathered all the materials and published an article titled, "System Error or Police Bias: What is Law Enforcement Hiding?" The interactive platform Reddit exploded with discussions after posts about the Williams family's situation began receiving thousands of comments. User Black Lives Matter. No wonder this is happening. The system is unfair. We need to support each other. User Police Account. Not all cops are bad. There are a lot of honest people in uniform, but we need to clean up the system of mistakes. User Skeptic 82. Why didn't they check the ID right away? Why did they arrest him based on one phone call? The discussions erupted into a heated exchange on exactly how law enforcement needs to be reformed, information verification needs to be increased, and transparency and accountability needs to be improved. Meanwhile, the police department itself was in turmoil. Shift supervisor Daniel Smith felt the pressure of the public descending on him with each new report and rally. He called an emergency meeting with other officers. "We have lost the trust of the community," he began. "We need to address this situation quickly, otherwise there will be big consequences for the entire police force." "They're talking about a systemic error," noted Detective Robert Hansen. "We have to present evidence that the arrest was lawful, but everyone realized that their chances of proving it were getting slimmer and slimmer. The evidence taken by the neighbors was too obvious and contained details that could not be ignored." At the same time, activists and lawyers for the Williams family, including John Meyer, began to coordinate a plan of action. They organized public hearings and engaged local deputies who supported their initiatives to investigate police mistakes. Together, they launched a signature campaign to gather signatures for an independent investigation into the actions of law enforcement. National news outlets drew attention to their case. One of the turning points was a video call that John Meyer made live on social media. He showed documents pointing out errors in the application that led to David's arrest. "We see details here that show that the police either failed to verify the information or ignored all the important facts. This is an error in the system and we must fix it." This truth sparked an emotional response in the comments under the video. People began to share their personal stories about their interactions with the police, facing bias and inequality. The social media platform became a tool not only to spread outrage, but also to create unity. People from different parts of the city and the country began to organize online actions in support of David and his family. The discussion of racial injustice has spilled over into public discourse, sparking the desire of many to fix the system and make it more transparent and fair. The police department was now at the center of a storm of public criticism, but it also faced an opportunity to regain public trust by showing a willingness to change and reform. Now everyone was ready for the fact that this information storm was just beginning. The next steps would lead to answers and real change. And activists, journalists, lawyers, and ordinary residents were ready to defend truth and justice to the end. The police department was literally overrun with rumors and discussions. Phone calls from journalists, comments on social media, and calls from activists did not stop anymore. Police officers were forced to rethink everything that had happened when, under the pressure of public opinion, they finally decided to scrutinize the identity of David Williams. Shift supervisor Daniel Smith gathered the team of officers in one of the interrogation rooms. He glanced at the reports and documents that were now on the table. John Meyer, the Williams family attorney, stood nearby, watching their every move. "Look at this," John said, pointing to David's ID. "This is his FBI identification card. David Williams works for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Why did you arrest him without verifying this information?" The officers glanced around. One of them, Detective Robert Hansen, frowned. "We got the information from an unreliable witness who mistook him for another man," he replied, trying to remain calm. "But why didn't you even check the database before arresting the man?" John continued. "Why was all the evidence and facts ignored?" The shift supervisor stood up and gave him a tired look. "We may have made a mistake, but that doesn't mean we didn't do things by the law." But it was at this point that the officers began to scrutinize David's credentials in the database and discovered that he was indeed an FBI employee. The mistake was obvious and unmistakable. The news that an FBI agent was involved attracted the attention of the very top brass of the Federal Bureau. The FBI's Washington Operations Division immediately dispatched a special agent named Laura Simmons to the city. Laura was an experienced investigator and knew her mission was to get David back and clear the air. She entered the control building accompanied by her colleagues, her gaze sharp and ruthless. "I'm Laura Simmons with the FBI." She introduced herself to Shift Supervisor Daniel Smith. "We need to get Agent David Williams back and find out how this mistake happened." She opened her laptop and showed her boss the information that David had an unblemished record with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. "We demand David's immediate release in an internal investigation within your department," Laura said, her voice clear and confident. The shift supervisor couldn't hide his concern. "We're already doing an internal review," he muttered. "The time for inspections is over," Laura replied. "Now the FBI investigation will begin." When Laura and her team began to examine the reports and documents, they discovered many disturbing details. They discovered information about corruption among high-ranking police officers. Some officers were receiving bribes from local gangs and turning a blind eye to crime. There was widespread prejudice within the department against African-American citizens, and much evidence was simply ignored if a suspect was black. "These reports show that there is a systemic problem in the system," Laura said as she analyzed the documents. "Our job is to clean up the system and regain the public's trust." News about it began to spread in the media, causing a wide public outcry. Journalists attracted expert opinions, showed evidence and testimonies of neighbors, activists, and lawyers. Monica Williams, even though she was under arrest in one of the isolation rooms, still kept up with the news through a cell phone she managed to get back from one of the activists. Had they found the mistake? She asked John Meyer, who was sitting next to her. "Yes, Monica," John replied, his voice full of determination. "The FBI is now involved in the case. We're going to fight to the end. This isn't just your husband's case. This is a battle for all of us." Monica felt empowered. She was no longer just a victim of the system. She had become a symbol of the struggle for justice. Joined by activists and local community support who were holding rallies and actions throughout the city, Monica, John, and Laura traveled to the city council building. "We demand change," they exclaimed. "We want the police to serve the people, not repress them." Politicians were forced to respond. The city council began discussing reforms to the police system. Measures were proposed to create an independent supervisory board to review the actions of officers, as well as mandatory racial sensitivity and human rights training for police officers. The Williams family case has now become a symbol of the struggle for justice and equality. Social media, activists, and the media have united into a powerful force that has begun to clean up the system and change public consciousness. The police department could no longer ignore mistakes and bias. Laura Simmons and John Meyer worked together to bring David Williams back and restore his name to the FBI. But the struggle was just beginning. The situation could become an example for the whole city and country, showing that change is possible and justice requires not only struggle, but also sacrifice. After the FBI intervened in the David Williams case and testimony, and reports were made public, the Williams family's story gained national attention. News of police misconduct and racial injustice began to appear on national television networks. The NBC television station aired an in-depth report with live coverage of activists, advocates, and journalists covering all the details of the arrest and the mistake that led to David's detention. The broadcast included interviews with neighbors who described how they witnessed the arrest and violence in their own backyards. This story is not just about David Williams. It's a story about how the system can break a person without a single foundation. We have to change something. exclaimed John Meyer, attorney for the Williams family, on live television. Social media exploded with discussion. Neighbors' videos of the arrest event, shown on internet live streams, went viral on TikTok and Twitter. The hashtags #JusticeForWilliams and #EndRacism in police engaged millions of users across the country. Twitter users wrote, "At activist, Emma, it's not a mistake. It's a system that is inherently biased against African Americans." At police reform. Now, we must reform the police. Public trust is not just words, it's an obligation. At support family. Williams, we support you. Let the truth come out. Young and old, men and women of different races and professions came out in rallies across the country, picketing and demonstrating outside local police stations. The police department has found itself at the epicenter of a public outcry. Chief Daniel Smith was summoned to City Hall for a meeting with the city's mayor. Smith's face was scrunched up with stress and frustration. "We did everything by the book," he reported to the mayor. "All this happened because of the mistake of one unreliable witness? We followed the law. But how could you arrest a man without checking the information in the databases?" The mayor asked him sternly. The mayor began to realize that the public was waiting for answers that could not be given by simple excuses. "We must have an independent investigation. The police department must be overseen by an independent committee that will verify all actions and reports." This decision of the mayor was applauded by the protesters. The Voice of the City publication, supported by activists and independent journalists, continued its investigation. Reporter Emily Carson found documents that showed the police department routinely turned a blind eye to residents' complaints if they involved issues of racial bias. She showed video footage of officers isolating documents and blocking requests from activists. "Here are the facts," Emily said on live TV. "This system does not protect citizens. It serves bias and corruption." Demonstrations in support of the Williams family began across the country. In Washington, D.C., there was a large demonstration outside Congress. Young people waved placards that read, "We need an end to racism in the system. We are all equal before the law." Many celebrities such as actors and athletes have supported the protests and used their platform to bring attention to the cause. Basketball player Levi Thompson, an African-American player in the NBA, wrote on his Twitter, "We can't stay silent any longer. This is not a mistake. It's systemic bias, and it has to stop." Together with activists and journalists, Levy organized a signature campaign to reform the police department and create a new platform to monitor the actions of law enforcement. During an independent investigation, it became known about existing corruption schemes in the police. It turned out that several high-ranking officers cooperated with local groups and received bribes. This cooperation resulted in crimes going unsolved and law enforcement agencies turning a blind eye to real problems in urban areas. The FBI searched the police department and arrested several high-ranking officers, including the assistant chief. Charges included bribery, covering up crimes, and bias against citizens. The police department was in the midst of disgrace, and the public was demanding serious changes in the system. Despite the challenges, the city's residents rallied together to fight for justice. Local activists, young people, community leaders, and even some police officers began to cooperate in an independent reform committee. They developed an improvement plan: mandatory human rights and anti-racism training for police officers, establishment of an independent supervisory board to monitor the actions of law enforcement agencies, technology updates for databases and information verification procedures. Over time, it became clear that this was not just a battle for David Williams, but for the future of the entire city and country. The city was now in the midst of profound change, but the public understood one thing: their voice was being heard. Out of chaos and injustice, a system was emerging that would become fairer, more transparent, and more accountable. After many days of confinement, David finally returned home. When he crossed the threshold of his home, he hugged Monica, and tears of happiness streamed down their faces. The children jumped with excitement as they hugged their father and couldn't believe he was finally home. But in David's eyes, there was a trace of his anguish. Those dark days in the cell, the isolation and humiliation that had left deep wounds in his soul. "I'm so glad to be back," he whispered, hugging the children tighter. "But this isn't just about me, it's about all of us who face this system of injustice." Monica held his hand and felt that their personal struggle was turning into a national mission. Now they are not only family, but a symbol of the fight for the rights of all African Americans. The Williams family filed a lawsuit against the police department. John Meyer, the family's attorney, led the legal case, his determination and wisdom a pillar of strength for David and Monica. Dozens of activists, journalists, and ordinary citizens showed up at the courthouse in support of the Williamses. The courthouse was surrounded by protesters. People held placards with inscriptions, "Justice for the Williamses." Police are supposed to protect, not suppress. Inside the courtroom, David Williams stepped to the podium. His voice shook, but he mustered the strength to speak. "I'm not a criminal. I'm a father, a husband, an FBI agent. But in the eyes of this system, I was just a black man who could be arrested for no reason. I've seen the system try to break us, but I'm here to say we will not give up." David talked about the days spent in the cell, the humiliation, fear, and pain. He described how his attempts to prove his identity were ignored by the police, how the system simply rejected the facts. "If it can happen to me, it can happen to any of us," he concluded. On the other side of the room were the police officers who were being held accountable for the arrest. They sat in strict suits, their looks confident and arrogant. Daniel Smith, a former shift supervisor, is now one of the main defendants. "I was following instructions, doing my duty," he said in response to questions from Williams' family attorneys. "I was doing my job." But testimony from witnesses and activists demolished his arguments. John Meyer presented videotapes of officers roughly throwing David to the ground, disregarding his ID and personal information. "It's not duty, it's not law, it's bias, it's corruption, it's injustice," John shouted over Smith's objections. Social media was once again active. Users across the country shared stories about their interactions with police and how the system can become biased and unfair. Opinion leaders such as basketball player Levi Thompson and actors from popular TV series expressed their support for the Williams family. Levi Thompson organized a marathon in support of the Human Rights Defenders Foundation, and actress Tamira Jones spoke to millions of viewers about the importance of fighting for equality and justice. Amid all of this, the local police department began to feel pressure from the city's mayor and an independent review board to conduct internal reviews and purge the ranks of officers. Journalists covered stories of other African Americans who had experienced systemic racism in other cities. These stories showed that the problem was not unique to one city or one police department. Questions about racial injustice became part of the national discourse. Monica Williams held meetings at community centers and schools where she shared her story and inspired others to fight for their rights. "If we remain silent, the system will remain the same," she said at the meetings. "But if we stand together, speak the truth, and demand justice, we will change the world." The Williams family became a symbol of the fight for justice and equality. Their lawsuit against the police department was an example that change is possible. But the trial was only the beginning. Ahead of them lay a new struggle for reforms in the law enforcement system and the return of trust between the police and the public. David Williams' story has inspired millions across the country and reinforced the belief that justice is not an empty phrase, but a principle worth fighting for to the end. In the wake of the trial and public outcry, the tension within the ranks of the police department was intolerable. Officers who had once followed the rules and carried out orders without question now found themselves in the midst of scandal. Many of them felt that their loyalty to the system and to the service had been lost in the shadow of the violent events they had become a part of. Among them was Sergeant Alex Randall, a man who had been involved in the arrest of David Williams and was now full of doubt and internal conflict. Alex was a commander at the police station in the north end of the city. He sat in his small apartment and stared at a picture of his daughter, laughing in a school photo. Those smiles reminded him that he had personal obligations to his family, but also to the community in which he worked. His mind was tormented by thoughts of what he had done, how he and other officers had suppressed and humiliated David Williams and then refused to see the obvious mistakes. "How could I have done that?" Alex said to himself in the empty room. That same day, Alex met with other officers who had been involved in the arrest. Many of them refused to discuss what had happened and defended their work. But there were a few who were willing to admit mistakes and talk about their consequences. We followed orders, but that doesn't mean we have to stay in the shadow of bias and corruption, said Officer Daniel Hughes. We saw what was happening, but no one explained to us why it was okay. Why should we turn a blind eye to the obvious? Asked Sergeant Mark Stanley, who had recently started having nightmares about the arrest. Alex Randall, after a long night of deliberation and pressure from his conscience, decided to be interviewed by independent journalist Emily Carson. He agreed to speak live on air, preparing himself for possible condemnation and the destruction of his reputation. Emily met him at a small cafe. Alex nervously ordered a coffee and looked into Emily's eyes. I was there. I was one of the men who arrested David Williams. I realize this may sound like an excuse, but I'm here to tell the truth. Alex began with a shaky voice. Emily, what exactly happened at the time of the arrest? Alex, we got false information from an unreliable witness, but I have to admit, we didn't check it out properly. Why not? Because there is a culture of bias and corruption in the system. We often prefer to turn a blind eye to the facts if it doesn't fit the orders we are given above. He fell silent and stared out the window. There are officers who take bribes. There are officers who turn a blind eye to real crimes if it might improve their reporting. And it's not just here in our neighborhood, it's happening all over the system. No one tells us about fairness or equality. We just follow orders, and that's it. Emily asked him pointed questions. Why do you choose to talk about this now? I can't hide it anymore. I'm a father, a husband, an officer, but above all, I'm a human being. I see what goes on around me. I see how the system breaks lives. I want people to know that not everyone on the police force is loyal to a system that protects corruption and racial bias. I want change. Alex said that his colleagues in other cities also face similar situations. He mentioned officers in other parts of the city who are aware of existing bribery schemes and biased investigations. These words were powerful evidence that racial injustice is not a localized problem, but a systemic disease affecting the entire country. Journalist Emily Carson broadcast the interview live. The television station spread the message across the country, and Alex became a symbol of the struggle for change from within the system itself. After the interview was released, Alex faced mixed reactions. Some activists condemned him for his participation in the arrest and for being part of the system, but there were also those who supported him for his willingness to tell the truth. The hashtags #inside the system, #truth and change emerged on social media with people sharing personal stories of facing bias in law enforcement and supporting Alex in his quest to change the system. With each passing by, Alex realized more and more that change was possible. He began working with human rights groups and independent investigators. Together, they developed a strategy for police reform. 1. Complete update of investigation protocols. 2. Mandatory human rights and anti-racism training for officers. 3. Establishment of independent control and supervisory committees. Alex was no longer just part of the system. He became a part of it that fought for transparency and honesty. He knew his path would be difficult, but he was willing to fight for justice, not just for his family, but for all those who face a system of bias and inequality every day. After the trial and the public outcry, the Williams family became a symbol of change. But they weren't going to stop there. David and Monica realized that their personal story was just the beginning. They decided to use their platform and experience to create real change in a system that had been deaf to their suffering for so long. Monica's primary focus was on helping victims of bias. She founded the Voice of Equality Foundation, which provided legal and financial support to African Americans who faced unfair treatment, as well as training and counseling programs for families who had lost trust in law enforcement. We need resources. We need people. We need a support system, Monica said at the foundation's first meeting at the city's community center. It attracted lawyers, journalists, activists, and former police officers willing to help. Soon the foundation began working with local community organizations and schools to conduct educational programs about human rights equality and justice. David focused on the legislative side of the fight. He worked with independent lawyers and influential politicians to promote initiatives aimed at strengthening law enforcement accountability. We need officers to understand that if they exceed their authority, if they break the law or infringe on the rights of citizens, they will be held accountable to the law. David was speaking at a city commission meeting. He proposed a bill called the Transparency and Accountability Act, which contains several key points. 1. Mandatory video surveillance in every police vehicle and in the stations. 2. Establishment of an independent police review committee, including civil society representatives. 3. Strict accountability for excessive use of force, including financial and criminal penalties. 4. Regular training program for police officers on human rights and racial sensitivity. We can no longer tolerate that a black family can be victimized by bias, David said in a TV interview. Our cities must become places where law enforcement truly protects everyone, regardless of race, creed, or social status. The Williams story inspired activists across the country. Community groups and local communities began to unite in campaigns in support of reform. Protests organized by Voice of the Cities groups took place in cities to demand police reforms. Social media was flooded with posts and videos of people sharing personal stories of interactions with police, discussing David and Monica's ideas, and encouraging people to sign petitions for changes in the law. Youth groups from schools and universities organized discussions about justice and equality. Many students volunteered at the Monica Foundation, helping others in spreading information about human rights. Not everyone in the police force was against the changes. Officers who supported Alex Randall's ideas began to join the Williams family's initiatives. They became part of an internal control and independent audit program, helping to identify and eliminate corruption and bias. One of them, Officer Daniel Hughes, became an advisor to David and Monica in creating new standards for police training and performance. "We can change the system from within," he said, "but that requires honesty, responsibility, and a willingness to work together." In just a few months, Monica's foundation has supported dozens of families affected by unjust police actions. Investigations were successfully conducted, people's rights were restored, and the guilty officers were held accountable. David soon submitted his initiatives to Congress, where he received support from some influential senators and representatives. The Transparency and Accountability Act bill began to gain momentum in the country's political space. The media covered the Williams family's successes and their campaign for police reform. Journalists described how public support and personal sacrifice led to meaningful change. Television stations featured interviews with activists, officers, and victims who now receive justice and protection. Social media continued to buzz, discussing successes and challenges. People wrote comments that change was possible, and everyone could be part of the struggle. "This is our common struggle," Monica wrote in a post on the foundation's page. "Each of us can take a step toward justice. Together we are stronger." David and Monica became symbols not only of struggle, but of change that began in a personal story but spanned an entire country. They showed that change is possible even when the system seems invincible. Now their goal was not just change in one city or one law, but to create a new culture where fairness was the foundation, not the exception. The system could be built differently, honestly, responsibly, and fairly. Though their struggle was just beginning, the Williams family believed that change would become a reality because justice was not just a word, but a law that they pledged to defend to their last breath. It has been exactly 1 year since the Williams family found themselves at the center of one of the most resonant and heartbreaking stories of racial injustice in the country. Monica and David, despite the odds, have persevered and continued their fight, now not just for themselves, but for everyone who has ever faced the bias and system that has been held against them. The family lived in their renovated home, where every room was now filled with human rights books, photographs, symbols of struggle, and gifts from activists and supporters. They didn't just rebuild their home, they rebuilt their faith in justice and the power of community. Early in the morning, David was making coffee in the kitchen. He smiled as he watched the children playing in the living room. Lisa, his youngest daughter, was drawing with crayons on paper, depicting a brave superhero who protects people from injustice. "Daddy, I want to be just like you," Lisa said as she approached David. You're already stronger than I could have imagined, he said, hugging her. We draw our strength from love, justice, and the fact that we never stop fighting for the best. The city was now seeing real change. New laws had been passed concerning transparency in policing. All police cars were equipped with cameras, and every police department was independently audited. Corruption has been almost completely cleaned out. David, as a member of the new police reform board, personally oversaw the firing of former officers who were once part of the bias system. This change isn't just a victory, it's a promise that things will be different, David spoke before the city commission, explaining plans to further develop the police training program. During this time, Monica remained active in the Voice of Equality Foundation, helping victims of injustice and their families. She organized consultations and workshops where people could tell their stories, receive legal assistance, and find support in the community. We all deserve respect and protection, she said. Let's make sure that everyone can sleep easy knowing that justice protects everyone, not just those with power or influence. The story of the Williams family inspired others across the country. Across America, communities and groups were formed and began to take action for justice and accountability. Young activists organized protests and social media campaigns that drew attention to injustices in their cities. David and Monica often invited representatives from other cities to share their experiences and create reform programs based on their personal experiences fighting for justice. The struggle doesn't end here. It just begins in every new city, in every new family, David said in an interview with a national television station. But together we can create a country where everyone is protected by law and respect. Despite all the accomplishments, the wounds were still fresh. There were moments when David and Monica felt tired and doubtful, but their love and faith in change were stronger than any challenge. One evening they were sitting in the garden where David had planted a small vegetable garden and grown flowers. Their children ran around, their laughter filling the air. "Mom, Dad, when I grow up, I want to make the world a better place too," said oldest son Daniel. "You're already making it better just by being a kind person," David replied, looking into his son's eyes. "Remember, justice starts with ourselves. If we are true to ourselves and the truth, the world will be a better place." The Williams family didn't just fight for change. They became an example that change is possible. Their story has been told in books, articles, and social media, inspiring people across the country to not only fight, but to love and unite. Monica's community programs and David's legislative initiatives were creating a new system where police and community work together for a common goal of protection and justice. "We were victims of the system, but now we are part of it," David concluded in his last address to Congress. "Let's build a future where everyone can have the right, dignity, and confidence that justice protects us all." A year ago, the Williams family found themselves in the shadow of a soulless system, but they emerged from it stronger, wiser, and more faithful to their mission. Their story was an example of resilience, love, and the fight for justice. They knew the journey was still far, but they saw that their efforts were not in vain. They were now symbols that change is possible in this country, where every voice counts, where justice truly protects and love and unity overcome all challenges. David and Monica looked to the future knowing that their efforts would be the foundation for a new America, a country where justice would stand not only on paper, but in the hearts of every citizen. Thank you for your attention and for letting this story be a part of your day. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. See you again.